Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harry Witchel. He's a senior lecturer and discipline leader in physiology at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. He is the author of a 2011 best-selling book called You Are What You Hear, and he did his doctorate at Berkeley in cell physiology. Please give me a warm welcome and thank him for coming tonight.
I'd like to thank the Society and Roy and Amy for such marvelous hospitality I've seen so far today. So I'd like to talk to you a bit about engagement and body language. In particular, I'd like to talk about reading the body language of engagement, what that means, why you might want to be interested in doing it, and hopefully I'll give you a scope of the whole background of why body language is interesting. And we might go on a little bit at the end for the experts as to what actually are the real challenges scientifically. And then finally at the end, I thought we might have a little bit of fun with a survey, a questionnaire that we're running, and see how we all get on. And I wouldn't mind collecting it at the end for a bit of data. I'm hoping the results will be surprising, but they might not be. You don't know until you've done them. So this is called disentangling two intelligible problems from one unspeakably complex enigma. And I'll tell you, the unspeakably complex enigma is, can we just have a computer read body language straight away and tell you what the emotion is? So let's go through this. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to introduce you to the idea of social signal processing. Social signals are those things that's body language in general. Social signaling processing is this thing that's sort of broken through in Europe. The Americans haven't really sort of twigged to it yet. And the idea is that we are always making signals to one another, such as with body language, which Americans, of course, are very comfortable with, as you guys. But what people haven't gotten around to is treating it like signal processing the way an engineer would. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is can we do this engineering style and come up with something that's really functional and faster than what I could do, say, when I'm working for the BBC doing body language. Okay, we're going to talk about two things, which is sensors and then interpretation. And in interpretation, I'm just going to ask you one simple question, which is, are there simple measurements or combinations of measurements that a computer can use to guess the mental state of the person that it's looking at, mental state or emotions? Okay, how did I start all this? Well, my background actually is it's in cardiac physiology. So this is a demonstration of an ECG. This is a Torsade de Pointe episode. So my interest was long QT syndrome. I did lots of drug safety analysis. And this ECG, if you guys are used to watching looking at ECGs on the telly and stuff, you'll realize this looks wrong, really wrong. Okay? And this is actually a patient who is, this patient was having an argument with a police officer, and then she collapsed straight away, brought into hospital while her ECG was being read. This is one of the episodes they saw. This episode here is called Torsade de Pointe, which is a very dangerous ventricular arrhythmia, and this degenerated into ventricular fibrillation. Now, fortunately, this woman was in the hospital, but VFib is usually pretty close to the end game when either people recover or they're dead in 3 minutes. What's interesting about this is that this entire process, so I won't tell you all the cardiac details about it, but this particular episode was triggered by an argument with a police officer. By the way, just so you're happy about this woman was treated with a pacemaker and beta blockers, and she was safe for the next 6 months of follow-up, so she was fine. But people who do suffer from long QT can come to unfortunate ends, and it's usually very difficult. It's often undiagnosed. Anyway, ignoring all that, what I'd like to get at, I started looking at mental states and how you could look at that from a cardiovascular perspective. And this is an example of the same man who's actually suffering from almost nothing. He's relatively healthy. He has high statins. He's a physician, so he went home, and the doctor sent him home to check whether he was complaining slightly of palpitations. And what the doctors wanted to see is overnight if anything happened. As it happened, that night something did happen. He got a call at 4 in the morning, and his brother-in-law had died suddenly without explanation. So he had a stress episode, mental stress, at 4 in the morning. He then, later that morning, at 8 in the morning, he had physical stress. And this physical stress, you can see, looks completely different from mental stress. And the way you look at that is you look at the distance between the top of this little hump here and the end of this here. That distance should be as short as possible. In physical stress, it's very healthy. That's the QT interval. In mental stress, it's completely different. Now, that's despite the fact that if you're looking at this, it's the same heart rate. So what I'm saying is that you can have physical stress and mental stress leads to very different events at a physiological level, and that got me really interested in things. I wanted to find out what's going on at this mental stress level, and this led me invariably to looking at various aspects about emotions. So with that in mind, I wanted to tell you a little bit about body language, and that begins really by talking about Clever Hans. So some of you are probably familiar with psychology will know Clever Hans was a horse in about a century and a half ago. And Clever Hans had an amazing trick, which is he would answer questions put to him by clipping his foot on the ground, and he would stop clipping when he'd gotten to the answer. So he could do basic mathematics. He could do a whole variety of different possible answers or questions to answers. Now, scientists were later called in to check this, and over again, even with the owner of Clever Hans out of the room, Clever Hans, this horse, could still get the answers right. It completely mystified them until they figured out the way to beat the horse, which was to have no one in the room know the answer. So if they had two people with half a question, and one person whispered into one horse ear, and another person whispered into the other horse ear, Clever Hans had no idea and couldn't possibly answer. He could bang his feet, but he would never stop at the right answer. But even if there was only a scientist, not the owner, they would give away enough cues that the horse would be able to stop at the right number. So the horse was essentially reading in the poker style what even scientists, let alone his owner, would do. And that's how the horse was able to get these answers. So I guess where I'm going with this is that humans give off body language in all sorts of amazing ways. And even animals can sometimes pick this up, although I think this particular horse is a fairly rare one. Okay, so let's talk about body language and what people normally look at in terms of body language and what they're interested in. So normally people are interested in questions like, can you detect lying just by looking at someone? Or the leadership questions would be, why is it that some people are able to speak in a way that compels others to follow them and to obey their orders? Or maybe romantic interests, are there ways of recognizing when someone is interested in you without even walking up and talking to them, without asking any questions? So that's traditionally the interest of body language, but I'm going to talk to you about the more dry, the traditional scientific side. Okay? In order to give you an idea about that, I'd like to explain to you the fundamental idea in body language that we're talking about. So this particular image is a particularly peculiar one that I set up. So I'd like to show you a little bit about incongruity. So incongruity is the fundamental body language issue. The question is, okay, we're getting all of these answers through body language. Why wouldn't we just ask people, what is your opinion? What do you feel about this? What do you think about this? And incongruity is the answer. So this is an example of incongruity. Incongruity is where different parts of the body give off different signals. And in fact, we all have many signals that we're thinking about. Now, in this case, of course, what you recognize here is that we have some signals for aggression that are being given off and other signals that are for happiness. This, of course, in English, there happens to be a word for this, which is very rare generally, which is play fighting. But most of the times in our lives, when we see incongruity, we will not have a word for it. There will be no explanation. What I'd hope you guys learn to do today is recognize when there are incongruous interactions, when people are saying one thing, but maybe doing something different, or they can have sometimes different sides of their bodies being incongruous. In any event, these incongruous activities are things that we're trying to pick up on and maybe getting to the bottom of what people are really thinking. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about an incongruity that many of you probably are familiar with, which is a Freudian slip. So a Freudian slip is when a person says the wrong word when they are trying to say something. But it can also be just a gaffe or a flub. That is, a person will have two ideas in their mind. They will collide in such a way that the person can't get the words out. You guys sort of get the idea there. I'd like to show you a film of something that I saw. I'd like to show you a film of David Cameron. And this particular film was done in 2010 before he was Prime Minister. So many of you may remember, some of you will have watched, there were presidential-style debates before there were 3 debates before the actual election of the last set of MPs, which led to David Cameron rising up. And I'm going to show you one of the set pieces where you'll see, so it's a 90-second speech. I'm not going to show you the whole thing. I'm just going to show you one small bit of it. David Cameron has had a lot of rehearsal with this. So remember when you watch this that he's had a lot of time to work this through. But I think the interesting thing about this is sometimes the truth will out whether you want it to or not. So excuse me while I try and get some, there we go. So we're looking for signs of incongruity here.
Third, we've got to start making things again in this country. It's no policy to just borrow from the Chinese and buy goods made in China. Fourth, we've actually got to get value for money in our public services. I want good public services for everyone, and we can only do that if we save and stop the waste. I want good public services for everyone. I want good public services for everyone.
So, suffice it to say, when I pointed that out to the BBC, they weren't interested in it at all. But this was before he took office. Obviously, we now know what his plans were. But at the time, you can see how there was a collision of thoughts, which would have led to something that was relatively revealing. Okay, so rationales for body language. So that's sort of an example of what body language might be used for. At a scientific level, our rationales would be second-by-second feedback from people. So that means instead of asking someone, what did you feel about this event, and getting their final and often rethought conclusions, you can get second-by-second feedback. You can also use this for effective computing. So as you guys can imagine, in about 20 or 30 years' time, we'll have lots of computers dealing with us instead of talking to each other. We'll just talk with computers, and those computers will have emotion-like expressions, and they will supposedly be able to detect our emotions. So there's a real interest in computer science to understand what emotions look like and how to portray them in the future. It's also genuinely of import for Asperger's and autism. These nominally, if we understand how to teach these better to these patients, they will do better. If they're high-functioning Asperger's and autism, they will be able to do better by modeling the world through ideas learned about body language. And finally, determining responses that cannot or will not be said. So instead of asking people you can ask people on a survey, if they cannot or will not say anything, that's where body language is important. So examples of this, non-verbalized emotions are babies who cannot say anything, dreams where you can't say anything, or misleading emotional displays, which would be incongruity. So one we've just seen is things like misleading people or lying, social conventions, which include display rules. So this is where you ask people, how are they, or do you like my dress, that sort of thing, and people feel honor-bound to be positive. And then finally, there's internal confusion. So that's with things like sales. And among salesmen that we've worked with, there's a statement that goes, buyers are liars. That is the idea that if a salesman is asking a buyer or a potential customer what they want, the salesman will listen to what the person says, but not necessarily believe it. Okay. So with that in mind, I'd like to start talking about some of the stimuli that I use and why I think that this lying issue might be relevant. So my experiments begin, I used to do dyads, so I'd have people talking, but now my experiments almost always look the same way, which is there's a computer screen and a person sitting in a chair in front of it. So over and over again, you'll hear about the person, the chair, the screen. And that's what's going to happen. I'm going to show you, but what's on the screen often varies a lot. So I'm going to show you one of the stimuli and why this works. So I'm looking at engagement, which is sort of the opposite of disengagement. So often I'm looking at interest or boredom. I'm going to show you one of the most boring stimuli I've ever created. It's tantamount to torture. So, there's method in the madness. You'll see in a moment why I've done that. So this is just a very brief bit of the stimulus. We'll start from, say, about here. So we start, every stimulus in my experiment starts with, or almost every stimulus starts with about 45 seconds of white noise. We'll skip all that. That's to get a baseline so that the physiological readings like heart rate, galvanic skin conductance, and things like breathing rate can get stabilized. And then you'll see something like this. So that's the start signal, the green flag, and here's the stimulus.
Kui sa tahad nagu ikka maksimaalselt head resultaat ennast välja võtta, siis teinekord see vaba aeg on ka nii-öelda mõtestatud aeg, mida sa tegelikult teed ka selle spordi.
Right, so I think you guys get the idea. So we don't explain to people what that is. What that is, in fact, is it's a 2-minute film of how to make pipes for sewers. There are no people in it. You see a hand at one point, and then there's a large piece of heavy machinery, but you never actually see any people. The voice, so we stripped out the voice of the documentary, and instead I got some an Estonian conversation, and then slowed it down so it was even more soporific. And that's what you hear. So those are two people who are speaking in Estonian. Inexplicably, years later, my current secretary happens to be Estonian, and she has told me that's actually quite an interesting conversation. But most of my volunteers, in fact all of them, they don't speak Estonian. They don't think it's interesting, or they shouldn't. However, we mentioned that there's an issue about whether or not to believe what people are saying. And this is why I'd say that. So the other thing about my experiments you need to know about is after everything, it's not my basic output, but after everything, I give people something called the visual analog scale, or the VAS. Those of you who are familiar with psychology will be familiar with this. It's what's called a 10 centimeter scale. So there's a line that's this long. It has little dots that go 0 to 100. And I ask where 0 equals not at all and 100 equals extremely. And I ask people questions along the lines of, after that stimulus, how interested were you? After that stimulus, how bored were you? After that stimulus, did you want to do that again? And it would go from 0 to 100. And I think the important thing to note here, so you've seen now what HTE looks like as a stimulus. And the vast majority of people put between 0 and 100, so well over 60% say it's between 0 and 30. I mean, quite a number of people will say 0. Obviously, the world is a subjective place, and what one man's 10 is another man's 0. So a lot of people will put 10 as well. But quite a number of people, maybe almost about a quarter, will put in about 40 to 50. But this last quarter is really interesting. Here what you see is about a quarter of everyone says, in terms of how interested they are, they're between 50 and 80. In fact, a reasonable percentage, over 10% of the people say 80 on interest. Now, this is the reason I believe in body language, because there's no way that anyone could have found 2 minutes of that interesting to the point of 80. And that's one of the advantages of designing your stimuli, by the way. When I design my stimuli, they are designed to be either really interesting or they are designed to be boring. When people tell me that something boring is interesting, there is a small percentage chance that this person is very creative, but not with that. There's no way. That was just, and yet, more than one person has said 80 interesting. So again, what we're getting to here is there are good reasons to look for body language and for more accurate moment-by-moment responses. So let me tell you a little bit about, I hope to tell you a little bit about body language just to tell you why I'm so excited about it. So body language has gone through an amazing, in the course of slightly more than my lifetime, an amazing change. So between the 1950s and the 1970s, there was a huge surge of interest in body language. Now that's not to say that body language didn't exist before then. Darwin wrote an entire book on it, on the facial expressions in man. William James, famous psychologist, did fabulous work in the 1930s. But really, things took off like a shot when Edward T. Hall was writing about Proxemics, which we'll talk about in a moment. And in 1966, in the popular mind, Julius Fast wrote a book called Body Language, which was the first time the term was ever used in public. So this was a huge change. Now, all of this was based on anecdotes. So people would see body language like what I showed you with David Cameron, and they'd say, holy cow, we can't believe this stuff is really happening. But there was no real statistics behind it. Between the 1970s and the 2000s, people started doing laboratory experiments trying to figure out what all this meant. And they were trying to get really hard and fast statistics. And they were successful at getting statistics, but the experiments that they designed were a little bit odd. So the experiments weren't necessarily all that meaningful. So for instance, let's say you wanted to know about personal space. So we all know about personal space. Everyone feels more comfortable. There are lots of examples where if one person, so if you have a conversation and one person has less personal space and another person has more, you'll see that person practically chase the other person around the room as they try and get closer to have a conversation. The other person keeps going backward. And they will do that unconsciously. They won't realize that's what's going on. Now, to test personal space, during the 1970s and 80s, large numbers of experiments, and I do mean a large number of experiments, were done as follows to determine personal space. You'd get the experimental participant to sort of stand here. Then the professor would just say, tell me when to stop because it's uncomfortable. He'd then walk straight up, stop, and then someone would get out a ruler and check. Now, and there's loads of data about this, absolutely loads of data using that precise protocol. Now, they got really good statistics, but I'm not sure in my own mind that that's a fair representation of personal space in a day-to-day environment, because it's very rare that all you do is think about your personal space. Usually it's something that happens in the background. Now, as these laboratory experiments were getting more and more accurate statistics, but less and less meaningful, I think, people started developing sensors which could be deployed, and we'll talk, sensors are going to be the mainstay of our talk. These sensors will be deployed in real-life situations, which would allow us as scientists to look at things in really exciting ways that were probably quite meaningful. At the same time, people started doing experiments in the wild. And this is this interdisciplinary term, in the wild, which means that you still do mostly laboratory experiments, but occasionally you just let go. And you just go out in a totally uncontrolled environment. And I've done quite a lot of these, and it's really exciting. It's really hard to know what it means. So for instance, we wired up people to buy cars. And we advertised for people who were looking for cars. We wired them up with all sorts of gear to measure heart rate, breathing, etc. We had microphones, hidden cameras everywhere, including inside people's neckties. And then we sent them in and said, okay, buy a car or don't, see what happens. And we did see a lot of evidence about how people go about buying cars. Although I must admit, it was very rare. We only saw one person actually buy a car while they were loaded up like this. But that was amazing. I mean, we saw what it looks like physiologically to spend 16,000 pounds of your own money. And I must say there was some excitement in it. But again, that's what in the wild means. So we're going through all of that, and you'll see as I explain all of this that these timelines are really important in terms of how experiments have moved on. Okay, so the two problems that we talked about. So we were talking about how to take how to make two problems and turn it into, how to take one problem and turn it into two things that I think of are important. The two things are sensors and processing, so detecting and recording specific gestures and movement. Okay? And the second is interpretation based on clusters. So given the recent set of gestures or movements, what cognition or emotion is likely, which involves pattern recognition. Now remember, some of you here are probably computer scientists. and are very comfortable with the idea that all you do is have the entire thing solved at once. That is, you have people, you make the measurements, and have the computer do neural networks and figure out the answers without telling you what the answers are. I'm not here to do that. Okay? I'm going to try and answer it piece by piece so that we can make some sort of progress on that. Okay. So that's neural networks. And what often happens, the neural network is going to try and match emotions to movements. Okay, so sensors. Just so you guys know about the terminology. So if anyone asks you, this is pitch. Pitch is moving forward and nodding your head. Roll is this way. And yaw is shaking your head no or on the azimuth. Okay, the way people measure this is often, so this is somebody else's chair. They will have a chair mat here, and they will actually have a magnetic field, which actually can pick up there's a magnetic field sensor on the top of the head. Magnetic field is generated around it, and it can tell pretty much exactly where the head is and the angle of the head. So that's what we're trying to measure. And one of the things that they found, so they play video games in this experiment, and what they found is that people move, if you have a video game, and there are pauses, between the pause and restarting, people move about 1 centimeter. They do this. Okay? So you need some pretty fancy gear to pick all that up. And the interesting thing is, they do that faster as there are more demands. So this is a video game with lots of airplanes coming at you, and you have to deal with it. The more airplanes, the faster they do this. And then while they're trying to do that. Okay, so that's one way of measuring, in this case, what I would call vigilance. Okay, and they measure that by looking at posture as well. So the way that they're looking at the posture is they're looking at total pressure on the seat and also pressure on the back. Now, what will that tell you? Well, this is the final conclusion they came to, but I'd like to sort of simplify it so that it's a little bit easier to understand. So what they looked at is net pressure on the seat, first of all, so this is at the bottom. If you have, as it turns out, low seat pressure, that is boredom. And that's probably because by this time you're like that. So you'll have very low pressure on the seat, and you'll have unusual large weight bearing on the back of the chair. Now, if the pressure is high, so F, by the way, is flow, B is boredom. Like flow is their excitement state, in this case. If you have high back pressure, so there's something where you're actually if you have high seat pressure, you still need to know whether or not something is going on in terms of net back pressure. So high seat pressure could be this. That would be flow, interested. But it could also be high, in which case you'd be leaning back. If you're leaning back like this, so you have a normal lean there, it then looks at seat pressure change. And if you have a lot of seat pressure change, that means you're fidgeting. So that's probably bored. And if there's no seat pressure change, that means flow. This is what these guys decided. I will later contest that, so we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the posture units. The things that we're looking at, so we're trying to figure out what's interested. Well, sitting on the edge of your seat, that's probably pretty interested. Leaning forward, that could be pretty interested. Leaning forward and right, that could be interested. Leaning forward left, sitting upright. Leaning back, it's slumping. Okay, these are the sorts of things people look at. All right, just briefly, I don't want to do too many graphs, just to tell you that there are a variety of ways of testing for this. One way is to use something called a Vicon, which is motion captured. Have you guys ever seen? Okay, so a lot of you will be familiar with the way they make video games and animation is they put little dots all over people, and you can actually use computers and a large number of cameras to figure out where people are. There is a problem with doing that with my experiments because your feet are under tables. So often there's lots of things that you can't be seen or can't be seen by Vicon. Anyway, we looked at other options. So in red is the Vicon. In green, we looked at an accelerometer, just looking at incline in the head. And we saw, as you can, I don't know, if you're chemists, you probably think it's really obvious that that we have almost perfect matching on the same day. If you're a biologist, you'll know that this is nearly impossible. You'll never see this again in your life. It's a very rare opportunity. What I saw is that you can do accelerometry, and it's almost as good as a Vicon for measuring head pitch. You can also see that it's almost as good if you do head roll. So you can use accelerometry. But if you actually do head yaw, you will find that it's absolutely useless. You cannot make this measurement. So we had a little problem with that. All right. The other thing you can use is face tracking, with or without markers. Most people are so you guys have probably seen face tracking on the telly. I'm not doing that at the moment. But The mouths are somewhat successfully modeled, but eyes are usually just found but not modeled. So face tracking has some real limits if you actually use the equipment in terms of just trying it. If you're lucky, they work, but if you're not lucky, they're actually pretty inaccurate. Here's an example of one of my colleagues. This is Paris Telecom, so we are talking about a major multinational. They're modeling laughter here with the Greta avatar. And what you can see is that the mouth is pretty much all right, but they can't really get eyelids right. So this looks terrifying, you know. It's just not happening here. So that, I mean, they're not getting laughter. Okay, that's sensors. I'd like to now talk about interpretation, which I think is, so let me just remind you where we are with this problem. We have people, they're responding, they're not telling you what they're doing, they're either leaning forward or back, they're in a chair. Two questions. First, how do we detect what they're doing? That's sensors, we've just covered that to some extent. I'm happy to take questions after. Now the real question though is interpretation. Okay, they're leaning forward or back. What does that mean? Does that mean anything at all? You know, are they moving around? Can we tell anything? So that's the question of interpretation. So, right. There are lots of different emotions out there that we could look at. The one that I focused on is engagement. And that's because I think of it as the easy problem. Of all the things, it should be really easy to detect engagement rather than will they buy, are they lying, is this true love? Okay? Those are all really difficult questions. As you'll find by the end of this talk, I'm embarrassed to say, you'll realize that actually engagement as the easy question has still kind of stumped me, but we're moving forward and making progress. But it's not, for an easy question, I found it's not that easy. Okay, so what is engagement? Well, engagement is slightly different from attention. So psychologists in the audience will be familiar with the idea of attention. That is, you look at something and you attend. When you attend, nothing else, you can't pay attention to anything else. With engagement, though, you can get engagement without attention, and you can have intention without engagement. So attention without engagement is like when you're driving and you sort of lose track and suddenly you find out you're home, but you don't remember how you got there, but you know you successfully drove there. So that's obviously you were attending, otherwise you would have driven into a tree, but you weren't engaged in the process. But you can also have engagement, as many teachers will know, you can have engagement without attention. And that is when it's essentially contemplation. So if you see someone in an art gallery and then they're obviously not attending to whatever artwork is there, but they are engaged with the process. Whatever the artist has done has obviously triggered the right sort of response in the viewer. So no eye contact, a lot of chin stroking. So with that in mind, I'd like to show you an example of an experiment we ran a very, very long time ago on an inconvenient truth. So you know how long ago it was. This was when it was in fashion. And we tried to figure out using hand coding. So remember the history that we go back. So this is before we had all the sensors and all of that. I had the most saintly laboratory technician, Neil, who could do any amount of work that I asked without getting bored, no matter how long it took. And Neil so I made him watch films. I gave him a list of things to check on a list, and he went second by second every single frame, looking through for a variety of different responses. He didn't have the sound, so he didn't know what he was looking at. He was just using a checklist in film. I'd like to show you the kinds of things that happened when people watched that film. So first, I'd like to show you how that film could consistently result in a response of happiness. Okay, so this is happiness in an audience.
The teacher went on to become science advisor in the current administration.
So they move slightly forward. Their heads move slightly forward.
The teacher went on to become science advisor in the current administration.
A little bit there.
The teacher went on to become science advisor in the current administration.
So that's pretty obvious. Filmmakers make films, they tell a joke, and then the audience either smiles, laughs, and if they're really engaged, they'll even move their head a little like that. You may have seen that. That's really straightforward. But it's very rare that a director deliberately makes part of a film that's disengaging that causes people to move away. What we were able to do is we were able to detect those things as well by using this kind of methodology. So, sorry about this. So here you'll see people moving away and disengaging on a consistent basis.
I actually thought and believed that the story would be compelling enough to cause a real sea change in the way that I actually thought and believed that the story would be compelling enough to cause a real sea change in the way that Congress reacted to that issue. I actually thought and believed that the story would be compelling enough to cause a real sea change in the way that Congress reacted to that issue. I thought that would be startling too.
So, I mean, obviously, body language is giving away a lot about how people are responding to this film, and that obviously that segment didn't work, and the director didn't realize that. I'm now going to show you something that's very unusual that body language can do. Is sometimes you could actually see the gears in people's heads going. So, in the next segment is a bit of it's irony. Irony is an unusual thing because as a form of humor, it usually causes people to smile. But actually, what's happening is what happens first is they hear something that they dislike and they'll disengage. Then they realize that it's actually said ironically, and then they'll engage because they agree. Now, normally, instantly, you'll just see people laughing and smiling. If you watch, though, in the second one, you'll see a woman in the back. She'll be the woman in the back, and you'll see it go through each of these steps. So what you'll see first is you'll see her respond to it by disagreeing dramatically, and you'll know that because she sticks out her tongue like this. Okay? Then she'll be horrified when she realizes, why is this guy who's supposed to be so nice saying something so bad? And she'll be surprised, and you'll know that because she does this. And then you'll realize that she suddenly realizes it's irony, and then she'll smile. And that takes her 2 seconds, and you'll see the whole process go through.
So, that seems perfectly okay. Well, so, that seems perfectly okay.
His tongue stuck out, eyes, and then finally she realizes. Okay, so you can see that people are actually processing this on a second-by-second level. Now, the reason so those experiments were run based on a list. So we're doing hand coding by eye, which is the way all this stuff used to be done before all the sensors. What you would see is you would be able to detect things. So when we did this with loads of people, so the upper line is engagement signals, the lower line is disengagement signals, and you can see when things are engaged. There will be loads of events that in the engaged line, none in the disengaged line. Here's another one that's a cartoon where people suddenly, everyone just responds to cartoons really strongly. Here are disengagements, so that was the cover-up, and that was the disengagement one you saw. There's nothing in the engagement, everything's happening in the disengagement line. Here are the signs that we were recording. So we were looking at smiling, eyebrow raising, mouth opening, and lip licking, all of which posture forward, sitting up straight, head pitched forward, so this sort of thing, head nodding, small head rolls when looking at it. So there are two different kinds of head rolls, so you know. There's this one, which that's often when people are thinking or contemplating things, thinking at a deeper level. Then there's this one. That's not engaged. So that comes under comfort creating, so that's shaking out shoulders, shrugging, sitting backward, body shifts, head pitches back, head roll stretch, anything about looking away, yawning, lip licking. So there's two different kinds of lip licking. The outward one, this is, that's rejection. That's acceptance. If it goes out on the side, that's yum yum. Touching face, pushing spectacles, coughing, sniffing, smiling. These are all disengagement signs. So I'd like to finish with the essential bits, the business end of interpretation. So the business end are three things that I think we can actually look at in terms of surrogates, what I could measure really quickly with this kind of equipment. So one is proxemics, that's the distance from each other. So if you have two people and they're in a room, I'll show you in a sec what that means. So that's their distance between them. Also, it can be the angle to the other person as well. And I'm talking here also about screens. So the other, in this case, in a lot of my research, is the computer monitor. The second thing that we can easily measure is total activity. Sometimes we'll look at just total activity of the head. Sometimes it'll be total activity of the shoulders. We currently don't do the hands because of technical limitations, because usually the hands are under a table or something, so Vicon can't detect that. But we're working on getting that. The final thing, so proxemics, activity, and the final thing is called interactional synchrony. And that's when movement between two things are coordinated between two people or stimulus and a person. Okay, so proxemics is how close people are. And we talked about it's a surrogate for personal space, so I told you about that experiment where you just walk up and you stop when it's too close. But it's also a surrogate for personal closeness. That is when people are, if you watch people who are trying to become more familiar with one another, they get closer. They'll often, particularly when they engage, so tonight at dinner, I watched two of my dinner companions, and when they got really excited, they would start gesticulating, which is activity, but they would also reach halfway across the table. And they would lean forward as well. And the kinds of things that, so one of the things I'm interested in measuring is how that works in terms of romance. So on December 5th, for those of you who are interested, I am running a speed dating evening hosted by the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. You may wonder what HFEA wants to do with speed dating. I can't figure it out either. I can only guess that every embryo starts with some sort of date like this. But the real reason that this is interesting is because we are going to be filming and tape recording absolutely every single interaction to get a complete corpus of understanding as to how speed dating works on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. And what we're hoping to find is that social closeness, that is choice among people, will actually be related to how close they get at the table, just by measuring in inches how close they are in the pictures. Okay, so this is an example of the sort of thing where you're looking at proximity, how close people get, they're reaching across the table and that sort of thing. And with that in mind, I'd like to run a little demonstration. I don't know how easy it is to work because you guys have sort of spaced yourself in a tricky way. Dear, oh dear. You guys, probably at the edge, you're out. You guys are going to be ones. Anyone who near you should be about a 2. What I really want, can you spend about 30 seconds with people who are near one another, one of you be a 1 and one of you be a 2? Can you just figure that out amongst yourselves? Because it's too difficult. Normally people are placed together. So take about 10 seconds to form pairs and figure out the person on that side of the room is 1, the person on that side of the room is a 2. Sorry, wrong way. Person on that side of the room is a 1, person on that side of the room is a 2. Organize in 2s, take 10 seconds, please. I can't hear what you're saying.
Invite people to ask about helping out with speed dates.
Okay, yeah. Okay, guys. Have you, some of you will only be in 1s, I'm sorry to say, but I'm hoping that those of you who are in 2s will be standing next to one another. In a second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to stand up in a second, and on the count of 3, I'll count backward, 3, 2, 1. On 0, you're to turn to the other person and see what you feel. Hopefully, we'll get something. If we won't, we'll find out. Okay, so why don't you stand up? Stand up for just a second. We'll see if this works. You guys have spaced yourselves in an unusual way. So when we get to 0, hang on a second. Ignore that sign and go the other way. You get the people, I've made the people on the left 1s, right? Okay, that's fine. If you're a 1, do the opposite of what that sign says. So if you're a 1, you're turning that way toward the window. If you're a 2, you're turning that way. And not now. On the count of 3, and we'll see if this works. So 3, 2, 1, 0. Do it. Okay. Some of you were a bit far away. You can sit down now. I noticed that you guys did something. How many people, did anyone feel like they had to step back or lean back? I saw you guys leaning slightly. Yeah? So did anyone else feel it at all? Not really. Not really. Okay. The goal of that, unfortunately, it wasn't very successful. When people are standing right next to one another, especially if it's with people they don't really know very well, what they find is that proxemics usually makes them, it's like it's way too close, like this. Whereas when people are shoulder to shoulder, they're not really fussed one way or another. And that's the idea behind personal space and proxemics. That is, when people get really close, usually if they're face to face, that's the two F's. It's either fighting or something else. And and so one of the things we're looking at is whether or not what makes people close. Now, the interesting thing about my research is, so the reason I say that's interesting is because if you go back to back with people, if you look at, say, like the London Tube or something, actually you'll see that people are quite comfortable or accepting of others being quite close to their back if they're back to back and that sort of thing. But if you look at body language, both in the literature and in popular body language books, they don't actually talk about personal space as being uneven. They talk about it as if you're like a little spaceman with a little cylinder around you, like that. It doesn't work like that. You have much less personal space and much less of an interest in personal space behind you. And the closer you get to the front, the more it's like really an intense sort of situation. Well, the reason that's important is because I'm trying to measure personal space with a screen. Now, we talked about how when people, when they're either dating and very interested in one another or they're about to fight, they get really close. But the truth is, you never try and kiss your computer monitor. You just don't. It doesn't matter if the person on the screen is someone you love. You know not to get any closer to your computer monitor than that. So this leads to an interesting question, which is, what is proxemics in a computer screen? And that actually has to do with angle. So it turns out that people don't approach the computer monitor that much more. It is true that people will move away if they see a film, but often they'll actually move their turn. When you actually are watching a horror movie, people, instead of going at the normal response, which would be back, they do this. They might even do a bit of shoulder action there. When people are interested, they'll stay straight on and there'll actually be a direct facing. Okay. Now, there are some, so we're talking about interpretation. I know this is graphs, but this is what I live for, sorry. Here's an example of forehead distance from screen. So we're measuring forehead distance from screen theoretically if you were talking about two people getting closer, so closer is down, this is further away, you would think that this would be actually getting much closer and therefore engaging. It doesn't work like that at all. So here's an example of why we need to measure multiple streams of information rather than just measuring forehead distance from screen. And I'll show you the films. So this is the second one. And you'll see that there are fundamental problems with the way that we interpret it. And we're going to have to teach a computer to read these things. We really have to get lots of information and combine it. So here's leaning forward. And what you see, this is the world's most boring quiz ever. And that's the giant lean forward. And the reason he's sticking his finger in his eye is because he's disengaging. He can't stand it. And that's another incredible forward lean. That's called load bearing, which is like that. You get really close to the screen. That's not engagement. That's absolute boredom. And it is, I'm very glad to say, that is to one of my super boring stimuli. So these guys are responding really accurately to them. That's all good. So what I'm saying here is that just measuring forehead distance from screen, and we're getting really good measurements of that, that's not enough. We need all sorts of other things, such as showing the computer where the hands are. So I guess what I'm saying is, I can tell, you guys can tell, but my computer can't just tell. It can't just look at one data stream and figure this stuff out. Okay. Activity levels are the next thing. Now, activity is another thing that's really difficult to interpret. Okay, so high activity can be aroused, that is kind of engaged, versus stillness, which can be catatonia or disengagement. However, high activity can also imply fidgeting, which is disengagement, versus focused attention, which is stillness, which is engaged. So it's one of these crazy things that's not even in the literature. But when people talk about activity, there are two very different ways of interpreting it. And the crazy thing is that often different people express it in different ways. So I'll show you a simple example. This is, okay, I'm not going to show you that example because I've copied the wrong film. Sorry about that. So, not that. Here's an example of somebody, though, where we're looking at shoulder energy. So this is the net energy of movement. And here what you see is this particular person is listening to an absolutely abominable piece of music. It's the worst violin music ever. And you can see that they're fidgeting, they're out of control. Whereas they're listening here to their favorite piece of music, they barely move at all, almost stock still. And remember, they're listening to their favorite piece of music looking at a black screen. At a black screen that's 2 feet away from them. They're not moving at all because they like the music. But it's different for different people. Okay, the final thing so we talked about proxemics, activity, and finally I'd like to talk about entrainment, and that's pretty much it. So entrainment is also called rapport or interactional synchrony. It's a dance of bodies. Interactional synchrony is this thing where two people who, if they really, really get along with one another, one person will move, the other person will move, one person will move back, the other person will move back. They'll be moving almost exactly in time. And I'll show you a little, that's interactional synchrony, and it's often associated with success in therapeutic involvement. So I'll show you some rapport. Just give you an idea. So what you're looking for in the next film, you can ignore the words. It's completely meaningless. It's two women, Claire and Katie. You'll see them, and they're talking about something they both love, and first of all, they both really like each other, and they're talking about food, which is a conversation they really love to talk about. And what you're looking for is when they move almost in synchrony for the same thing.
I was adapting right around Twitter since Sunday. So yeah, I have to pick something for them. The mushroom bar. Yeah, that's really good. But I have picked up everyone's come together since I had to continue this. So I think I've probably lost the recipe. Well, but also I think I've got the knack now. It's like doing rolling it up. Yeah.
Okay, did you see any interactional movements? You see all of that? Yeah? Did you see all 17? I want to show you what that looks like in fast motion because it's a lot more obvious. So lean forward, lean back, eyes down, hands up, lean back, lean forward, finger point, eyes down, Katie, lean forward, lean back, hands up, and stir. That was 29 seconds. So there's one movement that's shared about every 2 seconds. The reason that that's important, I mean, obviously they're getting along with one another, but the reason that's important is because it's associated with prosocial behavior. So if John Barge ran a series of citation classics in the late 1990s, where he asked 2 experimental volunteers to come in and do a task. Only one was a Confederate. And the Confederate was told, mimic the person subtly. So do a bit of rapport building, interactional synchrony. And what they found, first of all, is at the end of the experiment, if they did do a little bit of mimicry, so this interactional synchrony, that would increase their liking. It would also increase the other person's, the real experimental volunteers' estimate of smoothness of interaction, and in some experiments it was shown to increase their giving to charity. So between experiments, the Confederates said, oh, and by the way, I'm running this little charity thing, would you be able to give to it? More money was given if they'd done the interactional synchrony before than if they hadn't. Now, so that's the chameleon effect. That was done with deliberate interactional synchrony. But what happens with genuine interactional synchrony? That is spontaneous. Well, it turns out only in the last 3 or 4 years, they've actually been able to get the answers for that with the right kind of sensors. So what they've got at the University of Bern in Switzerland is an unbelievable resource where they have had literally hundreds of videotape therapy sessions, real therapy sessions with a therapist and a patient who was upset or unhappy. They have videotaped these entire things. In the last few years, Ramsar and his colleagues have figured out how to measure the activity just by looking at changes in pixels second by second. And that he's been able to show that if the activity is matching in time, that the patient was more likely to rate it as a successful interaction. The therapist was likely to say that the person had fewer symptoms and that overall their therapy session was more successful. And that's associated with spontaneous rapport. Now, all of these things, as I've probably mentioned to you, we're having difficulty measuring them. I guess what I'd like to leave you with is a simple idea. So this is from Wollaston in the 19th century. The idea is this, that we need to measure more than one. So I showed you what happens when you just measure people moving forward and back. It turns out if you don't notice what their hands are doing, you have no idea. So you have to be measuring lots of different things at once. These are two images. One of a person who's staring into space and the other who's staring right at you. Is that what you see? Hopefully. One who's staring right at you, yeah? Actually, though, if you look, you'll find that the eyes are identical. The eyes are pretty much the same. So if you only measure, if you're using eye tracking, say, and you're only measuring eye position, if you don't measure where the face is or the nose is, you're not getting anything because you're not going to figure it out. You're not going to get the right answer. Really, they are pretty much the same eyes. And they've known that for over a century. So the conclusions are that for sensors, there are a range of accurate measures for posture and physiology. So sensors have really made a strong coming, and more are coming down the line. So that's really exciting. Interpretation has made a lot less progress, but we are hammering away at it, okay? First of all, we know multiple data streams are necessary for interpretation, and that may mean fuzzy logic and looking at sets. And the other thing is that body language theory may help us to complement neural network results. So I don't think it can all be solved immediately. I'd like to ask also, if you would like to help us with the speed dating experiment as one of the scientists on the thing, or if you happen to know where we can get hold of a load of either, what do we need? Tripods and microphones, do help us. We'd love all the help you can. This is going to be an amazing experiment. Do speak to me afterward. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators at Sussex, Martin White, Karina Wessling, who's here today, Nachi Chankalingham at Staffordshire, and in my lab, all the amazing project students and students that I've had, and of course the funding, all these corporates who have been very, very kind to my lab and given us quite a bit of money to look at opportunities. And finally, don't forget to buy my book if you wanted to. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions. And thank you. Those of you who need to... Oh, the experiment. Do you guys want to run the experiment first? Oh, gosh, goody. Sorry, guys. For those of you... Okay. Okay, I'm going to explain to you what the experiment is about. These are emotions. So I'm going to show you some emotion photographs. And it's not that important that you do it fast. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds for each. Hello. So what's going to happen? First of all, at some point now or sooner, if you could fill out the top, which just is basic demographics, age range, male, female, final educational level, you're going to see a picture on the screen of a person. And what I'd like you to do is in the line for that picture, so each picture will have a number on it, in the line for that picture, could you write down in one word or two words what emotion you think that is? Just write down whatever you think it is, okay? At the end, I'm going to show you a list of the pictures, and I'm going to ask you the question, which is quite a deep one, which is, which of the emotions is it that you want more? Which of the previous emotions are the most important to you in your own life? Or which would you want more of in your own life? Okay, so here's the first emotion. What do you think that is? How would you describe that or label that? Okay, you guys all ready for another one? Okay. How about that one? That's number 2. How would you describe or label that emotion? You ready for number 3? Here's number 3. How would you label that emotion? How would you label or describe that emotion? You guys ready for 4? You ready? Okay. Number 4, how would you describe or label that emotion? By the way, I apologize for the 1970s photos. These are from many of these are from IAPS, the International Effective Photographic System. That is the official one that all psychologists use. It was made by Peter Lang in the 1970s, and it won many, many awards. So this is what we're stuck with psychologically. So there's lots and lots of 70s stuff out there in psychology labs. And number 5, how would you describe that? What label would you give to that one? Are you guys all sharing a pen? Yeah. Man. Okay, I'm going to let those guys do their thing because when you're ready. Okay, are you guys up for the last one? This is number 6. How would you describe that? Describe or label that one. You guys sort of there with that? Almost. Okay, this is the most important one, and it's really difficult, so I'll give you guys about 30 seconds for this. Here are the 6 pictures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Which of these is most important to you, or which of these would you really want more of, or you couldn't really do without? The most important one, the emotions in your own life. Deep philosophical one, isn't it? Okay. Have you all written, is there anyone who needs more time? Great. And my pen, I love that. Okay, you guys, you're all done. Pens down, please. Now you got to promise, we'll sort of do it out loud, and I'll then explain to you what's going on if you want me to. But you got to promise not to change your results at this point. You're sort of married to whatever you've written down. Yeah? And I want to collect these, so please, please, please leave them behind or send them to the end of your row. Actually, can you send them to the end of your row now? We'll collect them, and then I'll explain to you what's going on. Okay. Right. So I'm now going to ask, how many people put, is it too personal to ask you guys to put your hands up and do this, or should I just explain what the answer is? Do we want to see what the answer is? Yeah. You want to see? How many people put 1 as the answer for the final one? Okay, yeah, all right. How many people put 2? Okay. How many people put 3? Okay. That's good. Can I have 3 just up again, just for a sec? Okay, that's good. Okay, how many people put 4? Okay, you're looking around. Great. How many people put 5? Okay, this is good. I'm glad we've run this experiment. How many people put 6? Loads of people put 6. Okay, this is an experiment about sex differences and gender differences. First of all, did anyone, what were the names of 1 that you guys came up with? Did anyone have a good name for 1? Triumph. Triumph, on the first go. Did anyone else write triumph or victory? You guys are great. I thought most people, how many people put happiness? Hardly anyone. I'm at Oxford. I am at Oxford. That is what's going on. So we were expecting relatively few people to get 1 and 5. We were expecting that it would be gender biased toward males for 1 and 5. And in fact, that was exactly the opposite. We saw loads of women here just now choosing 1 and 5 as triumph, as things that they wanted. In fact, what was interesting in terms of gender balance was that 3 was almost exclusively male. There was 1 woman who chose it, but 3 was pretty much it. And the interesting thing was the number 1 thing that people wanted here was 6. So you guys were right, I was wrong. So gender bias was not what we expected. So we were looking at how sensitive people are to issues about triumph and victory, and whether or not people are aware of what those are and how to differentiate those between happiness. And in Oxford, I can safely say they have no problem with that. So
this is not a random winning. Is this a proper?
No, this is not a proper experiment, but it's what they call a convenience sample. And yeah, I'm always asking audiences different questions along these lines, and I can safely say that in Oxford, I expect people to know this stuff right off the bat. So that's good. You guys knew it very well. I'm happy to take questions, if there are any questions about the main talk.
Have you done any work on the way people interact with mobile phones?
Have you done any work on the way people interact with mobile phones? I am embarrassed to say that that is the next series of experiments as soon as I publish all of the stuff about, that is absolutely what we want to do. And there are people who work with me who are constantly kicking me and telling me to do that. And I am the one who always says, we must publish what we started first. So you're absolutely right. That is the next thing to be done. But I'm not working fast enough. So bad boy, bad boy. Yes, hi.
Do you see any differences in people with different cultural backgrounds, by the way? Like in the way they interact with content?
So the question was, do we see any differences in people of different cultural backgrounds? So I don't officially do sub-analyses yet. I'm expecting to do them in different cultures, but I can tell you some anecdotal differences that I have seen. Okay? And this is not the truth. I am not a racist. Okay, can I start that way? But if you want my observations, the first thing that women are different from men, and it's really obvious. When I showed you the descriptions of what's interesting, what's boring, almost no men get the answer wrong. If we show a man something that's boring, almost all men will say, that was boring. But a disturbingly high percentage of women will say, that was really interesting. And I kid you not, one of our stimuli, which is a background stimulus, just to get people started, is the blank screen for 2 minutes. So we actually put a blank screen. We say, we start the whole experiment, the green flash goes on, the screen goes blank, we're not even in the room, and we leave the person alone with a blank screen for 2 minutes to see how they respond. And they always say, you know, any normal person would say, and that was really boring. And unfortunately, one of our female respondents said, that was really interesting. I spent the whole time wondering what that was about, why you were doing this theme. So there is a dramatic difference between, I think, between women and men. And that's not saying all women, but I'm saying 30 to 40%. This may be, it's just Brighton women, you know, but because all of our experiments are being run in Brighton. But between 30 and 40% of women give what I would consider to be counterintuitive responses, which mean that I tend to try and recruit men because at least then I know what the subjective responses are. So you've asked what the differences are. That's one. The other thing I've noticed is that there are people of color. And actually, that's not even fair. I would have to say people specifically who are black respond slightly differently from white males. So they are more open in their responses. They laugh more when things are funny. They're much more excited when things are exciting. It's really, really obvious from their body language, dramatically so. But it's not fair to generalize, right? You can't generalize, but it's pretty obvious. So, yeah. But I'm not going to, if I tried to prove that scientifically, I'd be run out of town on a rail. There's no way I'm running experiments like that. It's just bad news. Yes, sorry, did somebody here have a question? Yes, you had a question.
Can you tell us what emotions you were thinking of when you put this up and why you think so many people chose 6?
What emotions we thought of. So the emotions of triumph or victory are also called in the psychological literature fiero, and that's 1 and 5. 2 would obviously be cheerful of some way, or you could just call it happiness or joyful. 3 is some kind of excited. I mean, it's obviously wild excitement, but you can see that it's actually a fiero situation, but this person is actually not just, it's exuberance, joyful exuberance. It's very high arousal. 4 is some kind of freedom or ecstasy, I would guess. That was the sort of thing that I would describe. And 6 is either delighted or, delighted might be 3 as well. 6 would be either incredibly amused, hysterical laughter, or just happy, another one of these happy, amused situations with life. I mean, the person is obviously, it's a genuine laugh, really amazing laughter. What we thought would be that men would choose fiero over women, which is not true in this audience. Almost, well, I mean, we'll get the numbers, but it's definitely not true for this audience. That's what we were looking for, and we were wrong. Sorry, was there another one? Hi.
Do you ever consciously alter your own body language because of the work you've done or anything?
Why would you say that? The question is, does one, if you're doing body language, do you change your body language? And the answer is way big, yes, big time, gigantic. It changes everything. The most serious body language change I made, though, was in California, which is the best thing of all. So changing your body language at a deep level is a thing about rehearsal and practice. And I changed my laugh, and it has served me well. So when I was a young man, I had a horse-like snort. It was a horrendous laugh. It made people embarrassed to be around me. And now I have a really deep laugh, which is much less frightening, and it's infectious and desirable to be around. So it's an improvement, yeah. But lots of, if you're talking about on a second-by-second basis, are you talking about do I do other things? It's usually about proxemics. So I can tell when people think I'm going too fast, and then I'll slow down. So the main things I would do, and these are the things that you might be thinking about as well, I either slow down or speed up or move back a step or move forward a step. Those are the big ones, or leaning in a bit. So that's huge. That more than anything else, those are the big body language changes. And of course, eye contact. Everything else is, you know, all this stuff about, I mean, you can make all sorts of hand waggling you like. But the bottom line is leaning in or leaning back, stepping forward or stepping back, and speeding up or slowing down your voice tone. Those are the biggies, and those are the ones that I do. And it makes a huge difference. So those are the things you respond to if you think you're losing people, or if you think that they need you to be closer or further away. Does that help? Hi.
Do certain types of body language appear at different ages? You know, kind of 6 months old or 5 or 10?
Of course. But you're talking about, so the question is, do certain kinds of body language appear at different ages? And of course, babies aren't born knowing how to smile. Smiling and laughter appears in the first year at different points. So lots of different things appear. Sophisticated body language, that is putting on layers, appears later. So starting about the ages between 5 and 7, children become more sophisticated. One of the things that, so when you see, so I don't know if any of you have seen a thing called Lie to Me, but that's a TV show which is based on a guy named Paul Ekman, who's now emeritus at University of California, San Francisco. And Ekman is sort of the granddaddy of facial expression. And Ekman has limited all of us psychology of emotion people by giving 7 standard emotions or 6 standard emotions, which are the pure ones. Everything else is based on this if you believe in Ekman. And Ekman rules, if you know what I'm saying. So your options are, if you're a psychologist, if you're interested in psychobiology, your options are happy, sad, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, and contempt. Those are your 7. Everything is built on those. If you actually do body language work, like me, and do film analysis, you will find the Ekman 7 almost never. They're just never there. Ekman has told me they're there all the time. I never see them. They never appear, okay? Everything is really complicated. People are doing all sorts of weird stuff, except, and this is a big exception, if they're under the age of 5. If people are under the age of 5, they do the Ekman 7 like nobody's business. Young kids have the most, when they suddenly are happy, their faces light up. They explode with joy. It's the most beautiful thing to watch. If you look at people who are in their 20s and try and get them to be happy and smile, and you just won't find it. They'll always have some sort of little limitation. There'll be some sort of gurning for the camera. Something will come up that will ruin everything. So what I would say comes up over time is emotional control and emotional sophistication in a big way. So the Ekman 7 start to disappear. Does that answer your question? Hi.
What does a BBC body language expert do?
What does a BBC body language expert do? You do what you're told a lot of the time, which means that I'm often asked to watch or sometimes even listen to political debates. So it's usually politicians, but it can be other celebrity types, and then make some sort of statement, almost given an open remit about what kind of statement to make about this particular interaction. Usually what they're looking for is who won, who's the daddy. I'm less interested in that. I tend to be more open-minded. I look at all sorts of things that are going on and figure out what's secretly going on, what's really interesting. And usually they cut all of that and they go back to who won, who's the daddy, who's more confident, what's going on. So the elections, for instance, so this is 2 years, it's very old now, but the elections were great because there were three debates over a 3-week period. And what you watched was such dramatic changes in the politicians. So I don't know if you guys remember, but in the first one, Nick Clegg came out of nowhere. And it was beautiful to watch because Clegg had really slick body language. He's a natural on the one hand, and they let him alone. They didn't realize he was going to do that. So there was something amazing that happened. It was beautiful to watch as a body language expert, and I could describe all of that. Meanwhile, David Cameron, who is anything but a natural, he would have admitted at that time he was a disaster. He knew that his face would turn bright red, he's easily embarrassed, and the whole time he did one procedure which you must never do during this. He tried to be keep himself above petty argument with Gordon Brown. But the way he did that is, if you watched him, he did this kind of movement. So he's stepping back from the microphone all the time, which meant that he was chicken. He was cowarding out. But what he was really just trying to do is give some distance between himself. By the second debate, someone had gotten to him and told him, don't do that anymore. Okay? So he stopped that. And by the third debate, they realized that what they weren't actually arguing for the audience. Interestingly, Americans have become more sophisticated. So the first thing you can do if you're on TV, you can make your argument to the audience. But if you want to make votes, millions of votes, you don't argue to the audience, you argue to the camera, that big black thing right in the center. But actually, if you look at how the American debates go now, they argue to the audience. The camera catches them from the side now. So the British have only just caught on to so that's the kind of observations I'm making. Does that make sense? And it was a really fascinating election where you saw David Cameron go from not very good, by the end he was excellent. And it's exciting for me to watch these kinds of changes and to document them. Hi.
So it's not so topic, but something again that we can also have an aspect of voice. So I used to work at somewhere where we were interviewing people on the phone all the time. And one of my colleagues saying that she took this something who was quite good, she was trying to interview, was quite reluctant to give answers, and she found that she was slipping into his accent gradually. The more she slipped into his accent, the more forthcoming he was. The more she sort of sounded slightly like him. She said the more she did it, the more he just became more open. I suppose the academics and Rapport mirroring how that's into his voices.
Okay, so I think there are three questions. I'm not sure if I can unpack all of that. So there are three things going on. The first is, do they study voice tone? The second is, do people, as they go on, does their voice tone get worse or something? And the third is about imitation chameleon effect with voice tone. Is that right? So it's
it wasn't meant to be, but yeah, maybe.
So
if people imitate each other's movements when they have a rapport, is it as when people don't work on how that works with voices as well?
Okay, so it sounds like you're asking about the chameleon effect, yeah, and whether people naturally imitate one another and whether people look at that in terms of voice tone. So there's lots of work that's being done on voice. In terms of the chameleon effect in voice, I actually don't know that people are doing that because it's harder to say what's going on. I mean, all you can really, so voice is much harder to measure than all these other things, believe it or not, because there's some free software out there called PRAT, P-R-A-A-T, where you can do voice analysis. But the bottom line is everyone's voice kind of has a signature. So the most you can really do, there's no way right now, for instance, that you can do anything except hand scoring for accents. So really what you can do possibly is pace, and maybe if your F0, your tone, your pitch gets higher. So I think the answer to your question is that's an area open for research. I don't want to keep people. I know that I think there's a thing. So I'm happy to talk to anyone in private. And if you are willing to help with the spontaneous, the dating, the speed dating, do let me know. Otherwise, if you just have other questions, I'm delighted. You guys have been an absolutely great audience. And I'll meet you guys all outside. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.